Okay, this is a case study called The Differential Impact of Gentrification on Communities of Color in Chicago. The cycle of community reinvestment and displacement of low-income residents is a process present in cities throughout the United States, Europe, and other developed nations. It has been well documented in numerous studies, also referred to as gentrification and displacement. It has been the source of considerable policy debate in Chicago at both community and citywide levels. Displacement, particularly when it takes place as communities are being revitalized, can move low-income populations further away from the very housing, educational, and employment opportunities that could ameliorate the problems of past social and economic exclusion. Because community reinvestment was often seen as increasing racial and ethnic inequalities, the City of Chicago Commission on Human Relations approached the Loyola University Chicago Center for Urban Research and Learning to examine the impact that gentrification has on different racial, ethnic, and economic groups in Chicago. The commission routinely receives complaints from the residents and elected officials about increased racial and ethnic tensions in some communities experiencing reinvestment. Because many city development policies are predicated on the assumption that community investment is always positive, the Commission felt it a need to look at this process more closely. New heading here, the Center for Urban Research and Learning, also known as CURL, the Loyola University Chicago Center for Urban Research and Learning is an innovative, non-traditional, collaborative university community research center that only completes research when community partners are involved in all or most phases of the research. Described in more detail in Chapter 2, CURL recognizes the need to combine the knowledge and perspectives of both university and community partners. Without these combined perspectives, we're typically missing half of the picture in understanding issues facing local communities. Exclusively discipline-driven research agendas do not always hit the target in providing information and insights for current pressing community issues. In working with community partners, CURL has been able to both pool relevant information from past discipline-driven research and add information that is relevant to the community's immediate policy concerns. In the case of research on gentrification and displacement, much has been written within the field. However, the specific concerns of the Human Relations Commission around current racial and class tensions have not been the focus of the majority of this work. Moreover, unlike academics who are completing an end product that will be of interest to fellow sociologists, community leaders are interested not only in the information, but how it might fit in the policies and neighborhood level solutions. When community partners are involved in shaping the research and typically participate as respondents in focus groups, interviews, and surveys created by this collaborative process. Research data have policy ideas and solutions embedded in them. It is this natural link between research and solutions that has characterized much of Curl's research. New heading, the study. As is typical of Curl projects, we enlist a team of researchers that include faculty, graduate students, undergrads, and community partners. The primary researchers include 2 sociologists and a psychologist. Among the others involved in the project, particularly helping in community-based interviews and focus group, were 3 undergrad students, sociology and psychology majors, 3 graduate students, 2 sociology students, and 1 community psychology student, and a recent sociology PhD recipient who was working on fair housing issues in Chicago, because there was a need to establish credibility and rapport in diverse communities, and the diversity of the team was also important. The team included African American, Latino, Asian, and white Anglo members, which bolstered credibility both with our primary partner, the Human Relations Commission, and with interviewees during the research itself. Although we provided a general demographic picture of citywide gentrification and displacement trends, we focused our report and interviews on 2 specific areas of Chicago: the predominantly Latino West Town and Humboldt Park community areas northwest of Chicago Central Business District, and primarily low-income African American Mid-South Side, comprised of 4 Chicago community areas: Grand Boulevard, Douglas, Oakland, and Kenwood. Both of these areas are identified by city officials and researchers as the city's current gentrification hotspots. In particular, the study measured perceptions of community leaders about the impact of the gentrification process. We interviewed or included in focus groups 68 business leaders, community-based organization executive directors, social service agency staff, religious leaders, and others who were familiar with daily life in the 2 communities studied. These are people on the front line of community activities. They're among the most perceptive of social and economic changes in their community. They are also aware of how residents perceive, interpret, and react to the changes that are going on around them. New heading, findings. Gentrification and displacement in West Town, Humboldt Park, have taken on a distinctively Latino versus non-Latino debate. Puerto Rican culture has defined the neighborhoods since the immigration of Puerto Ricans in the 1960s. Residents describe a block-by-block gentrification process that they liken to removing their community piece by piece. I call it erosion because that Puerto Rican character, the Latino character in the area, is being eroded. They are huge areas of Humboldt Park that are gone, that are lost to us through gentrification. There are whole neighborhoods here Says a West Town community leader. The cohesiveness of the Latino community is viewed as threatened. In the Mid-South communities, initiatives to preserve African American historical institutions in Bronzeville have become a focus of community leaders and economic development proposals. These are not necessarily linked to plans to reduce residential displacement, which has already occurred, but rather are connected to economic reinvestment that preserves Chicago's African American historical roots on the South Side. Bronzeville emerged as one of the most visible African American communities in the United States after the Great Migration of African Americans from the South to northern cities. Located 2 miles south of Chicago's downtown, Bronzeville served as a hotspot for African American art, culture, and society in the 1920s, and later claiming historical figures such as Langston Hughes, Nat King Cole, Louis Armstrong, and Lorraine Hansberry as residents. Diane Graham's case study in this same section discusses the use of Bronzeville's rich cultural history and its current redevelopment. Although the building of large high-rise public housing developments in the 1950s and 60s provided more affordable housing in the area, the large number of buildings and deterioration of tenant screening and management ultimately contributed to economic decline in the broader community. There were distinct differences between the gentrification and displacement processes in the two communities. In Westtown Humboldt Park, those being displaced were very much aware of those displacing them. Current residents routinely saw the gentrifiers moving into the rehabbed or new houses as their neighbors left apartments where they may have lived for more than 10 or 20 years. Gentrifiers were typically middle-class white Anglos, while those displaced were usually lower-income Latinos. In contrast, the gentrification and displacement process in the Mid-South Side communities happened over a 30-plus year period. It was more of a depopulation, displacement, and then gentrification process, the opening up of suburban housing opportunities for middle-class African Americans after federal civil rights legislation in the 1960s led to an exodus of middle-class families who previously had few housing choices outside of the neighborhood because of persistent discriminatory practices in exclusive white communities. In addition to this depopulation, persistent racial segregation, lack of infrastructure investment like schools, libraries, and streets, as well as deteriorating housing quality and eventual teardowns of previously desirable apartments and graystone houses caused the community to be even less desirable and created a further exodus of working class African Americans and even some low-income families from the 1970s until the noticeable reinvestment after 2000. Absentee landowners sat on the vacant lots left after the teardowns. In addition to this, after 2000, the Chicago Housing Authority systematically tore down scores of high-rise buildings representing thousands of low-income housing units. However, many of those units had been vacant for as many as 10 or 15 years before the buildings were demolished. Ultimately, in the first decades of the 21st century, the available empty space, along with increased city infrastructure investment, the transformation of CHA properties to mixed income developments, interest in creating an African American historical district, and the booming real estate market combined to open doors to neighborhood redevelopment. Since 2000, the gentrifiers, mostly middle-class African Americans, typically moved to new housing built on these long vacant lots or into subsequently rehabbed graystones that may have been vacant for years. In this community, most of the gentrifiers and the displaced were obscured by time. Those displaced in the 60s and 70s were long gone before middle-class gentrifiers started moving in during the early 2000s. This time gap eliminated the possibility of gentrifier versus displacee tensions. Also, since both the gentrifiers and those displaced years earlier were African American, race was not a point of tension. If there was any tension, it revolved around social class differences. Given these different histories of the two communities, the gentrification process was viewed differently by residents of both communities. In the African American South Side, it was seen as a more positive process. Many consider the revitalization process long overdue. Although there were significant concerns over what was happening to displace low-income African American residents, the prospect of a middle-class African American revitalization of the area's past heyday of black culture was seen as a positive. In contrast, the West Town Humboldt Park, where the ethnic dividing lines of Latino and Anglo were congruent with the visible gentrifier displaced dividing line, the revitalization process produced stronger ethnic tensions and was perceived in a negative light by many people living in the community. Our report raised a number of other issues in both communities, the difficulties that communities face in countering outside forces that are reshaping neighborhoods when there is little input from current residents was apparent. In West Town Humboldt Park, developers converted affordable apartments into market-rate condominiums. The process through which developers bought up rental properties to convert into new condominiums was largely done out of the sight of community residents. Even community-based organizations struggled to get information on housing sales and permit applications. When they did not find out, or when they did find out, it was often too late to seek avenues to preserve buildings as affordable rental properties. On the Mid-South Side, both the absentee landowners and the government represented forces outside the local community's reach. In the 1950s, construction of massive numbers of high-rise public housing buildings by the CHA on Chicago's South Side not only reinforced Chicago's racial divide, but created the concentrated poverty that ultimately set the stage for wholesale community deterioration. In the neighborhoods adjacent to the CHA developments, absentee slum landlords profited from inflated rents. Buildings were not maintained and ultimately were torn down. The outside land speculators bought up cheap vacant lots and sat on them for years with the plan to make money when the neighborhood came back. From the perspective of local residents, community organizations, and nonprofit community developed corporations, the current day revitalization was seen as a positive in some ways. However, just as outside forces had helped to determine the community's fate more than 50 years before, similar outside forces were directing the community's comeback. Okay, new heading: Outcomes and impact of the research. Since the project was developed at the request of and in cooperation with the City of Chicago Commission on Human Relations, there was a built-in user of the research from day one. Since the commission is called in to mediate many neighborhood disputes, particularly those with racist or ethnocentric overtones, the research added a social class dimension to the commission's understanding. Our close study of Humboldt Park helped shed light on Latino, white, non-Latino, African American tensions. This is particularly salient in a city where there has been a very large increase in Latino population, a 38% increase from 90 to 2000. The study of the Mid-South Side, while not seeing racial tensions, did shed light on the social class dynamic and tensions within the African American community. This is also of interest to city policymakers who want to strengthen the presence of the African American middle class in the city and stem the decades long flowing from the city to suburbs. A month before the final report was to be completed, there was a suggestion from the mayor's office that the report should not be released given the volatile nature of the gentrification debate. This was itself an indirect measure of both the impact of the study and political divisions within the city administration. Ultimately, discussions between the commission and the mayor's office turned back the suggestion that the report be held back. When it was released in January 2006, the report was immediately distributed to all of Chicago's aldermen who were in the final stages of debate on the exclusionary zoning ordinance. The ordinance would require that certain portion of the units in new multifamily construction be affordable in cases where the city had provided financial support or zoning variances for the project. There had been a multi-year battle by a coalition of community groups to pass this ordinance. Mayor Richard M. Daley had resisted passage of an ordinance that would include a 25% set aside for affordable housing units. However, in the aldermanic elections that had just taken place a few weeks earlier, it appeared that a veto-proof city council majority supporting the high set-aside might be in place when the new city council was sworn in at the end of the month. With a more aggressive council about to take office, the mayor supported passage of an exclusionary zoning ordinance with a 10% set aside for affordable units and new privately developed larger multi-unit buildings. Although our report and its linkage of gentrification to displacement issues to racial and ethnic tensions was only one of many in the consideration of the ordinance, it made a small contribution to the ultimate passage of the city's first exclusionary zoning ordinance in late January. Curl was proactive in making sure the report got into the hands of a variety of community-based organizations, arranging media coverage of the report and posting the full report on our webpage were two of the ways in which information was distributed. Curl also made a number of presentations to community organizations around the city, particularly in the specific communities studied. The report stimulated additional work with community partners, including a block-by-block analysis of apartment to condominium conversions in select neighborhoods. As with other Curl projects, undergraduate and graduate students were actively involved in the research and writing that went into the report. They're listed as authors and researchers on the report. Perhaps more important, they became increasingly aware of how the research fit into ongoing community efforts to bring about equity in Chicago's neighborhoods. Watching the politics of the research from the role of the commissioners in helping to frame the research questions to the hesitancy of the mayor's office in releasing the report to the new city council legislation, students recognized that they were among the players in Chicago policymaking.